In Westbridge, every notification carries a story. A simple message can change a life. And sometimes, love begins beyond the screen. She met him on a gaming server called Westbridge, in a lobby that smelled of late-night coffee and recycled heat from too many computers. Avatars drifted like small, determined planets. Pixel knights, neon foxes, a graceful moth that always hovered near the help channel. He was a quiet presence there, a user named Hailstone, who logged on at odd hours and answered the same 3 questions as patiently as if they were prayers. Where to find the weekly raid, who could spare a spare part, and whether anyone wanted to talk for a minute. When she was 12, when life felt like a series of closed doors, and the library's fluorescent lights were the only steady thing in her world, she'd made an account just to be somewhere that didn't ask for her papers or her history. People in town called the library the heart of Westbridge, but for her it had been the only place that let her be small, even when everything else pressed in. Her avatar on that server moved carefully. She called it Moth, because it could fit into corners and no one asked it questions. Hailstone noticed her. He noticed small things, her quiet replies in the lobby, the way she tagged herself new while she watched and learned. He was older. The banter suggested as much, a voice tempered by years she didn't yet know how to count. He sent kindness the same way others traded loots, without announcing it, in small folds. When she told him, one winter night, that she often missed dinner because the bus fares cut the days raw, he offered directions to the soup kitchen and a map of community pantries. A week later, a brown paper bag appeared on the long oak table beneath the history shelf in the town library. A sandwich, an orange, a note folded twice that said simply, "For Moth." She never knew his face then. She only knew the username and the way his messages arrived like a cushion when she had no place softer to land. That bag kept her through a week when there were no coins for the bus home. It smelled of warm bread and something faintly herbaceous, like someone who believed a sandwich could be an argument made in kindness. She kept the little folded note for years, folded inside an old shoebox with a stuffed dinosaur named August. The note was the first evidence that someone had seen a child without a last name and decided to do something about it. Years later, the server's chat threads still existed in the same tired way. Communities repeat themselves. New nicknames, the same jokes about lag, the same players logging in to remind each other they were not quite alone. A handful of them, people who had once been strangers, arranged an in-person meet at a cafe in town. Westbridge's real-world gatherings were casual affairs, no banners, no formalities. Tessa said yes before she could talk herself out of showing up. It felt strange to meet anyone whose avatar had been part conversation partner, part lifeline. She took Laya with her, her daughter, 4 years old, who insisted on wearing a tutu in winter because it made the world clearer. The cafe smelled of steam and sugar and old wood. Rain smeared the glass outside. The town's pines pressed their wet faces against the windows as if they wanted inside. Laya twirled in her chair under the table and bit the edge of her muffin with a seriousness that broke Tessa's defenses every time. When the man sat, he folded his coat over his lap, as if he were used to being watched and had decided to make a small private world out of public noise. He looked at her with a face that did not belong to any youthful screenshot she'd kept. He had the neat friction of someone who wakes early, a jaw that carried rest, and eyes the colour of things that were expensive and well-made without needing to shout. Up close, his hands were those of a man who keyed in numbers for a living. The knuckles had the calm economy of someone used to keeping time and not always letting it in. Tessa recognized the bearing behind his avatar before she recognized him by name. There was something in the way he tilted his head when someone else made a joke, an attentive smallness that her memory catalogued like evidence. Hailstone had been careful, never flashy. She listened until the right sentence threaded between coffee and a laugh, and then said it, quietly and unadorned. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked. The phrase was a soft gamble. People were different away from their screens. The man blinked as if someone had asked him about a place he'd been to once in a dream. Then the name he had used on the server came back to him with small, stumbling shock. Memory is funny. Sometimes it arrives like a bell. other times like a bruise. He remembered the moth account, the odd late-night questions, an exchange about where to find a warm meal. "You, moth," he said, and his voice thinned in a way that made the table between them feel like a thin membrane. "You were—" "Tessa," she supplied. Tessa had a life that most people in town would paint as steady enough. She kept the library hours, shelved books like a quiet ritual of order, and spent afternoons running story hours with a voice that could make dragons sleepy and spiders polite. She'd learned to answer the same patron questions with the same patience the server had taught her, how to be useful without being asked. But her nights were tight with bills that liked the sound of empty pockets and a quiet worry that sat under her ribs like cold metal. When she told him, in a voice that smoothed out like practiced linen, about the brown paper bag, his face changed. He grew still in a new way, as if someone had turned down the room's temperature and exposed a face used rarely and kept for moments of truth. He didn't leap into apologies or explanations. Instead, he listened like someone trying to locate a lost part of themselves that might still be warm. "I thought it was nothing," he said later, a confession without an audience. It sounded absurd. How often did someone's compassion look like nothing until it stacked up into a life? He had been a kid then too, a teenager with more privilege than he fully understood. He had logged on to the server because someone had told him online friends were good for staying up late. When he'd heard about a young user who kept asking where to find soup, he'd done something small, ordered a single delivery to the library and told the staff the name with a question mark. It was the sort of anonymous thing that let a person feel good without the awkwardness of proximity. He'd never expected its weight. Tessa looked at him with cool, careful eyes. Pride lived there, the kind that learned patience and learned defense. She had learned the difference between help that asked for everything in return and help that arranged itself so the person on the receiving end could walk away without being measured. She kept that brown paper bag memoried and secret because something in her knew mercy should not be debt. Laya reached across the table and touched the man's sleeve like she owned the territory. "You're the man from the pretty games," she declared with the blunt, excising logic of a child. "Do you have a sword?" He smiled, the first real smile that week, and scooped August, the stuffed dinosaur, from her lap. The dinosaur smelled faintly of detergent and the library carpet. He joked about being a terrible sword-bearer and promised to protect Laya from dragons the size of overdue fines. Laya believed him in the way small children do, with a total suspension of skepticism. It made something ease inside Tessa that she had thought hardened for good. The cafe meetup was gentle enough, a string of simple conversations about favourite books and worst bosses, and the ways the town seemed to fold in on itself every winter. But tenderness has its own weight, and when the man left he pressed a small card into Tessa's hand with a number on it. Not a big number, not a flashy one, just a phone number that belonged to someone who left the right kind of messages. She put it in her wallet next to the shoebox that held August. Stay until the end to see the reveal that changed a town. That early invitation to hold on felt cartoonish as she walked home beneath the cedar boughs, Laya skipping the puddles as if they were small lakes to be conquered. Tessa told herself not to think about it, about how a person who had once left a sandwich could now sit across from them with a name printed on a company card. Grayson Hale, CEO. Names in town travel fast. Small towns stitch themselves around people's histories until they become taught. He was a person who could order the world with the right numbers. She told herself that didn't matter. She told herself she liked coffee and that the rest could stay where it belonged, on the server, behind usernames and warmth. But life is the slow accumulation of small troubles. 2 weeks after the cafe, Tessa found an envelope at her mailbox with the town's indifferent mail stamp. Eviction notices are ugly things. They smell like formal endings and come printed in ink that thinks it knows the future. The landlord had conflicted with the mortgage company. Pressures aggregated. Roads that needed fixing meant taxes rose. Tax assessments meant landlords passed costs to tenants. The letter was a polite pivot toward necessity. Pay in 30 days or the house would be vacant. Tessa had no savings. She had a library job and a temperament that learned to make do. Then Derek came back into town. Derek had been a name that hovered in the town's low conversation like a bad smell. He'd been a season of absence, a man who had a child's paternity on paper and a flinty appetite for convenience. He carried appeal in a way that made the wrong kind of trouble. He arrived classically, with justification and a timeline that suggested he'd had a reformation in the city and now wanted to shepherd what he believed to be his right. People judged him quietly. Children's fathers have a way of turning up when the cost of avoiding them grows smaller than the cost of appearing. He showed up at the library one Wednesday to ask for the hours and stayed to gossip, to ask about Laya, as if he had always belonged. He asked for more time, for weekends, for a chance to prove himself. Tessa listened in measured disbelief. He had left. He had not been family. He had been a promise undone. The town noticed his polished shoes and the stories he told of big city jobs and better schools. He filed papers the next week, a petition for custody, and an emergency motion that suggested Tessa's housing instability would make her unfit to parent. When the legal papers arrived, they created a cold thing in the kitchen, a stack of officialness resting on a cereal box, demanding immediate choices. The court takes the child's best interest as its compass, but best interest is a hard, malleable thing to measure when a parent can point to a childhood with steady rent checks and a history of presentable, bankable involvement. The law doesn't like the chaos of small-town economies. It prefers the tidy logic of documentation. Tessa knew that on paper she was an unsteady ledger. She sat on her kitchen floor, Laya asleep on the couch with August tucked under her chin, and read through the motion with hands that trembled not from fear only, but from the sharpness of anger and exhaustion. This wasn't a dramatic courtroom scene from the movies. No whistles, no last-minute discoveries. It was a humble stack of signatures and a judge's date stamped like a judge's heartbeat. The hearing would be in a month. She would have to justify herself in front of a man who wore dignity in the form of a robe, and who would ask whether she could provide what the child needed for a normal life. Grayson saw the thread before it snapped. He watched Tessa from a distance. His distance had its own gravity. He had been trained to watch and to decide. Helping had been easy decades ago when a sandwich meant a life saved for a kid in a library. Helping had become complicated as his world filled with legal counsel and trustees and PR people who asked the wrong kinds of questions. He did not want to hand over an envelope in public. He did not want to make a spectacle of rescue, but he also remembered the room with the history shelf, and the way a child had read under the light, and how a bag of food had felt like a secret permission to be a kid again. Tessa's refusal came not from pride alone, but from a deep lesson in dignity. She had learned how to take charity and not be costumed by it. She would not be proverbially indebted to the man who'd once put bread into her hands. She had taken that sandwich with a tiny private gratitude and folded it into her life like a secret talisman. The thought of being paraded as someone who had only survived because some rich man decided to try his hand at saving seemed to infuriate and sadden her simultaneously. She wanted agency. She trusted herself. Grayson offered help the way the server had taught him to, quietly, without ceremony. When the emergency line to the hospital who handled children's care lit up, Laya's fever spiked one late night from a cough that had become something louder. He was the man who'd predicted and prepared. He made a call to an acquaintance who worked as a liaison at the hospital and covered the immediate costs on a payment arrangement that left the bill addressed to anonymous donor. Tessa found the invoice in the morning with a note. Payment processed. No signature, no expectation. She tore the party down in her mind. She wanted to refuse the favor the way she refused handouts because it felt like handing over ownership of her life. Yet August clicked in the shoebox, and in the quiet under her child's breath, she recognized how precarious their arrangement had become. She did not want Laya moved to the other side of the county because her landlord's mortgage had been adjusted. Grayson's interventions escalated in small, legally plausible ways. He didn't just pay the immediate bill. He contacted an old law school friend who ran a pro bono practice. He created, through legitimate channels, a small, restricted, educational fund for Laya that sat in trust and could only be used with court approval and for the child's benefit. Tuition, medical, educational expenses. No strings, no public fanfare. The trust had a chain of custody that would not collapse under scrutiny. It would not be a magic check-writing name on a smiling page. It would be a legal instrument designed to protect a child's future without usurping parental rights. He was careful to consult professionals who could keep anonymity while preserving legitimacy. Anonymity through a professional guardian ad litem arrangement. Funds routed through a non-profit with a confidentiality clause. When Tessa learned the truth of one gesture, the paid hospital bill for Laya, she felt a complicated knot of gratitude and humiliation. She wanted to say thank you into the open, to fold the man into the same human space she was trying to keep small and manageable. Yet she could see the scaffolding of power behind his kindness. She resented the way people assumed the world owed them pity and the way money became shorthand for care. She did not want to be someone's charitable project. You can't just save someone's life and expect them to forget the cost, she told him once, voice steady in the library between stacks of books, Laya at her feet playing with crayons. Her words were not accusation only, they were an attempt at negotiating the terms of any future kindness. She wanted to accept without losing herself. He listened and, for the first time, let himself be narrow and honest. I don't want to own the story, Grayson said. I don't want you to feel small because of it. I only want to make sure she's safe. A brief pause in the story. Be honest. Have you ever met someone online who changed your life? Tell me your story in the comments. Back to the story. That small, private conviction changed the tenor of their conversations. He stopped offering obvious, performative solutions and began asking practical questions. Are the heating ducts fine? Is there a food program you trust? Are there grants for library programming he could support without being visible? He spoke mainly in lists and pragmatic sentences. It made her feel both grateful and guarded. Small-town gossip can be a weather pattern. She knew his name would make the rounds in the coming days. People were already fusing his online reputation and his formal identity into a narrative they'd soon tell at the hardware store counter and at evening dinners. The petition from Derek arrived like a new weather system. A short, sharp set of demands and a request for an expedited hearing. It claimed instability, suggested professional involvement that Tessa did not know how to disprove, and assumed, with a confidence that made her stomach drop, that the court would decide a child would be better off with a father who had the patience to show financial proof. There are moments when the world rearranges what you thought were immovable things. For Tessa, the legal papers were a line drawn across the living room, an invisible border that wanted to take her daughter away. For Grayson, they were a problem he could not fix with a network meeting or a budget spreadsheet. He had to translate memory into responsibility without erasing the person who had kept herself breathing for years. He convened professionals quietly, a lawyer willing to take the case pro bono with the understanding that any true support would come through legal channels, not through public checks. A social worker willing to testify to Tessa's involvement with community programs. He used an instrument he had helped fund in the past to fast-track childcare support for a month while the hearing date neared. Everything was done in a way designed not to announce itself. He could have bought headlines. Instead, he bought time. Tessa found the envelope with the custody filing the same week she found a flyer for a children's literacy grant that required matching funds. The timing felt like malevolent choreography. She read the motion again and again, and then placed it on top of the shoebox with August and the small folded note and watched Leia sleep. Thighs curled under her like a small geography. What if they take her? Whispered the question that had no good answer. You do not choose your troubles, but you choose how they are born. Tessa called a friend and made an appointment with the county aid office to see what options might be available. She combed through the library's records to show her stability. Volunteer logs, programs she had run, letters from parents whose children had received help in the story hours. If the court wanted documents, she would give them the spines of her life. She would make her ordinariness into evidence, Grayson watched all of this with a strange, uncomfortable pride. He had not intended to involve himself beyond paying a bill. The server had taught him smallness, the humility of anonymous aid. But watching Tessa move through the necessary rituals, calls, paperwork, the small indignities of proving your competence to a system built to sort you into comfortable boxes, stirred something in him that was deeper than obligation. He remembered the moth account and the lonely child inside fluorescent light. He remembered being the holder of a small kindness that had changed a trajectory. His involvement would be anonymous for legal and ethical reasons. He could not, would not, wave money and expect it to take root. So he made harder choices. He secured a lawyer who could be an advocate in court without the press discovering a benefactor's identity. He established funds structured to meet legal scrutiny. He reached out to contacts who could vouch quietly for the town's investment in its people. All of it was technical, procedural. It was his way of converting private remorse into public protection without stripping the woman he had come to care for of dignity. When the first court date was set, the town murmured in ways that were not always kind. People chose sides, the way a weather vane chooses wind. Old friends asked if she was okay. The lunch lady at school sent an extra sandwich. There was a rhythm to small-town kindness that was rarely silent and often messy. Tessa kept her head down. She did not like being watched like a specimen in a vase, and yet she was tired enough to accept help if it came in the right way. One night, a week before the hearing, she lay awake and read the old note, for moth, until its edges softened with familiar fingers. The thought of the man who had left it, once nameless and now very named, unsettled her. She had built a life around careful self-possession. Now someone else's history had intruded into the space she had kept for practical survival. The server messages that had once been a shelter became a complicated map. Connections are not the same as obligations, but they can generate them. Grayson had obligations now that were not merely fiscal, they were moral. He had to reconcile a person he had been when anonymity was possible with a person he was becoming when power was evident. In the days leading to the hearing, small things happened that kept grief and hope braided together. A neighbor dropped off a casserole. A patron noted the library's impact on their child's reading level and wrote a short, heartfelt letter. Laya learned how to write her name in big babyish loops and wanted to take it to court like evidence. Tessa taped the letters into a folder and labeled it evidence of care, because sometimes a person must reframe love as documentation. On the morning the motion was to be filed, Derek showed up with a lawyer who smelled of new suits and a calm confidence that annoyed Tessa's every nerve. He stood in the street and waved as if he were establishing a household. The months of absence did not erode his appetite for ownership. Tessa called Grayson out of a defiant need. He met her at the courthouse steps, not to step into the arena, but to stand at its edge. He offered her a folder with a single page, a referral to a competent lawyer, a letter from a social worker who had observed Tessa's parenting over years, and a note that offered help in accessing certain funds. He did not offer to pay her mortgage. He offered the scaffolding of defense, and it was different. "Take it," he said. "I don't want headlines. I want you to have what you need to make your case." She looked at the folder, at the neat stapled report, and then into his face for an angle that would give her permission to trust. Shelter is not just roofs and funds. Shelter is also the right kind of tool to make your case to a system that wants tidy answers. She accepted the folder because sometimes dignity is not about refusing help. It's about choosing the form help takes. She would accept assistance that kept Laya safe and kept her agency intact. A week later, the papers were filed formally. The first hearing was scheduled. The town hummed. People took bets in safe tones. Small-town sympathy is a kind of public currency, easy to spend and harder to earn. Tessa felt the old fear and a thread of something else, a precarious amount of faith in people who had, in various ways, made themselves present. Grayson walked away from the courthouse that day with his hands in his pockets and the taste of something like resolve. His gifts had to be careful because the court would look for strings. He had designed them to be invisible, legal, slow and legitimate. He had to become, in some ways, the adult the server had only hinted he might be. Someone who could do more than click send and notice that the world continued. He had to get his hands into the dirt without yet announcing his name. Tessa returned home and found Laya making a tiny sign from construction paper, the letters lumpy and perfect. Stay. Under it, August lay like an old guard. Tessa taped the sign to the refrigerator with a solemnity usually reserved for holy things. She made tea that was not very strong, sat at the small table with the custody papers folded into a practical square, and thought about how close she had come to making peace with the world because of strangers who understood smallness. At night, when the house settled and rain returned to the Pines, a new message pinged in a corner of the Westbridge server she still frequented. A few of the old names were there, circling and checking, like people arranging themselves for weather. Hailstone logged on, not as a man with a billboard, but as someone who had once been anonymous and now felt old enough to be careful with his signatures. He read a simple line, an offer to help when the world tilted, and left no fanfare behind it. Tessa read the message the next morning and felt the slow limbs of old memory loosen. She knew the server's voice. She knew kindness when it arrived, not to make her small, but to make sure her child had room to grow. The hearing loomed like a coastal storm. People make choices in storms. Some shelter, some flee, some declare themselves open to changing weather. The week before the hearing, Laya came down with a fever again, and Tessa found herself at the ER at sunset, watching the fluorescent ceiling squares go by like small planets. The nurse who took Laya's temperature knew the family's face from the library story hours and smiled with relief when the diagnosis was simple, a viral fever that needed rest and fluids. The bill sat at the desk like a polite ultimatum. It was then, after the pharmacist's quiet inventory and the nurse's practiced calm, that Tessa found an envelope tucked into her bag by the social worker, a receipt with a notice that payment had been made on behalf of an anonymous donor with a match code and a contact line she could call for more services if needed. She stood at the hospital doorway, the reception light fuzzy in the rain and her daughter's small hand in hers, and considered the ways help can arrive. Late-night messages on a screen, a bag placed on a table, an invisible wire transferring money across systems. She had been taught to keep pride like armor. Now that armor felt both protective and heavy, she wanted to throw it away like a cloak that no longer fit. She wanted to let someone in, and yet she feared the kind of sympathy that rearranged people into tokens of someone else's benevolence. On the street outside the hospital, Grayson waited in his car with a cup of coffee gone cold on the passenger seat. He had paid the bill anonymously through a hospital contact who processed donor gifts and kept names confidential for those who preferred it. When he watched Tessa stand in the rain, with her child's smallness anchored to her hip, he felt the old memory like a pulse. It was no longer an abstract kindness. It was the familiar geometry of a life he could help stabilize. He would not enter her world with a parade or herald. He would not ask for recognition. He had learned enough to know that the true value of kindness is measured by whether it makes a life smaller or larger. He chose ways that enlarged Tessa's options without erasing her agency. He arranged lawyers. He pushed for social worker notes to be drafted that reflected long-term neighborhood involvement. He wired funds into educational trusts with conditions and guardianship designed to reassure a court without buying custody. Yet he knew there would be a cost. Emotional, not financial. The town would whisper. Derek would lean on the institution's natural bias toward tidy solutions. The judge would ask questions that cut to the bone. Tessa would have to stand in a public place and be measured. Grayson could make sure the measures would not be unfair, but he could not make himself vanish from the morality play that would unfurl. On the eve of the hearing, Tessa sat at the small kitchen table and opened the shoebox one last time. The folded note had softened edges. She unfolded it and read the single sentence again as if it might contain a secret password. For moth. There was a hand-lettered simplicity to it that felt like a promise and a shame all mixed together. Down the block, a streetlight hummed. In a downtown where people kept their attention close and their judgments closer, small acts, had a way of echoing louder than intended. 3 years ago, a bag of food and a note had become a memory that kept a child fed. Now those same fragments had woven themselves into a complicated lattice of legal strategy, anonymous trusts, and a fragile tenderness. The court date arrived with a bright, public clarity. Tessa put on a coat that made her feel like a person who could stand in public. Laya wore socks with dinosaurs and clung to August like a talisman. Grayson sat in the back row of the courtroom, an observer without announcement, his palms folded. The judge called the docket. The town murmured and watched. But that is where the map bends. The filing Derek made had language designed to prod the court toward a quick decision. The law's compass, though, is not headlines. It is the child's best interest, and that is measured in 1,000 quiet ways. As the hearing began, statements accrued like small building blocks: teacher notes, volunteer logs, social worker testimonies, which, when stacked, refused to buckle under the pressure of an absentee father's sudden concern. Grayson watched the proceedings like someone seeing the future he had once only glimpsed at a distance. He had engineered anonymity into the funding, but he also knew that the justice of the system would resist spectacle. He would have his chance to influence things without making a display, to make the kind of contribution that allowed Tessa to keep her dignity. The judge asked practical questions about housing stability and support networks. Tessa answered. Names of people who would testify to her care, copies of program schedules that kept Laya fed and occupied, the substitute teacher's note that Laya's social development was on par or better with peers. Derek's lawyer offered the image of a father who could offer more time and more money. The court listened, and the judge weighed like a slow hand. When the hearing recessed, the crowd cradled its gossip like a bird in both hands, eager and careful. People stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse and started to reweave their narratives. The small-town machinery went back to its tasks. Grayson left without a flourish, his work and his motives still private. But the fight was not over. The court had required more documentation. There would be further hearings, a need for a legal strategy that respected the law's boundaries. Tessa walked home with Laya's small hand in hers, and the realization that this was not a single battle, but a campaign. She had felt a thread of fear relax into tension. It would need resilience to hold. 3 years out from that quiet first meeting in the server's lobby, and the small act of anonymity that had once been a single sandwich, the town's life was only beginning to reorganize around that seed of kindness. People would speak in years about how one simple gesture had become complicated and, in some odd, round way, beautiful. In the meantime, decisions had to be made that were practical, legal, and painfully intimate. Tessa folded the motion and slid it back into the shoebox. August peered up with a plush smile. She kissed Laya's forehead, small and stubborn and brave, and whispered promises she meant to keep. There was a knock at the door that evening, 3 soft raps that made her heart lift with a familiar anxiety. She opened it to find a plain envelope resting on the stoop, addressed to her with no return name. Inside, a short letter and a number for a lawyer. "For when you're ready," it read. She looked over the street where Grayson's car had been parked months before, when he dropped the folder at the courthouse steps. The rain had cleaned the world bright and small. She folded the note into her pocket like a decision she had not yet been asked to make. There were more hearings to come. There were more choices. The town would watch. She would prepare. Some kindnesses start as a single note on a screen. Some become the scaffolding for a life. In the days that followed, the server's chat threads spilled into the town in small human waves. People who had once been avatars now were neighbors, and the meeting between 2 people who had shared digital nights now complicated into a real-life contract between care and dignity. Grayson, who had once made a one-off decision to buy a sandwich for a nameless child, found himself stepping into a moral geography he had never chosen, guided by memory and something stronger than penance, a desire not to be absent this time. And yet, the crucial moment had not arrived. The hearing would be scheduled, more documents drafted, professionals called. The small-town court would convene to make an ordinary but piercing decision about a child's life. Grayson's anonymous interventions had bought breathing room. They had not, and could not, close the case. What would happen next, and how Tessa would navigate the public gaze without losing the private parts of herself that were most precious? Those were questions that required more than generosity. They required trust. The storm line had formed. The next steps would test everything kindness and resolve could hold. The morning of the decisive hearing arrived with a low, steady sun that made the frost on the courthouse steps sparkle like small, indifferent witnesses. Tessa tightened the scarf around Lia's neck and slid August into her bag as if the dinosaur were an extra piece of armor. There were voices in front of the building, neighbors trading updates, someone making a joke about the coffee at the corner shop. And Tessa pretended the chatter was music she could choose to tune out. Inside, the courtroom was the same slow machine as any other. Oak panels warmed by generations of business, a clock that made time feel resolute, and a judge whose neutral cadence could turn a lifetime into notes on a page. Derek sat with his lawyer, posture immaculate, his promises folded into legalese. He looked like a man who had rehearsed responsibility. He did not look like a parent who had learned the shape of an everyday life. Tessa's lawyer, quiet, efficient, eyes that read facts with affection, arranged her papers into an orderly stack. There were volunteer lists, letters from parents, the log of story hours, and a social worker report assembled with care. There was also the trust documentation, a professional, unbranded packet that showed a restricted fund in Lia's name, with explicit legal guardrails. The documents were configured so any court could find them legitimate without creating a spectacle of gratitude. When the judge asked about housing stability, Tessa answered plainly. The landlord had agreed to mediation. She had applied for local assistance, and there were neighbors who could testify to steady caregiving. The social worker spoke of Tessa's routines, the consistency of story time, the way she'd organized playgroups so children had structure. The testimony had weight because it was specific, small, and concrete. Derek's lawyer leaned on the standard picture, a father with resources, more time, a promise of better finances. It was a persuasive portrait when painted without context. The judge peppered questions about school proximity, medical coverage, and the child's attachment, and asked both parents to speak to the child's best interest. Tessa's voice, when it came, was not theatrical. It was measured and fierce in its own quiet. She spoke of the nights she'd stayed up reading until the words felt like a lullaby. Of the mornings she'd rearranged volunteer schedules so Lia would have more playmates, and of the small rituals that had kept their household together. Pancakes on Sundays, August tucked in at bedtime, library runs through the rain. She did not beg. She provided the sound of a life lived awake to its responsibilities. The judge considered the stack of evidence, the wet, severe logic of the law weighing minutes against memory. In the end, the ruling followed the slow gravity of the facts. Primary custody would remain with Tessa. Derek would be awarded supervised visitation with a plan to revisit the arrangement in time and under professional observation if he showed consistent engagement. The court emphasized support, resources, monitored contact, and a mandate that no decision be made that would fracture a child for convenience. Outside the courthouse, the town breathed and exchanged versions of events like ribbons. Some were surprised, others relieved. Tessa's relief was a quiet thing that arrived as a sinking breath and a loosening under her sternum. She did not dance or triumph. She went home and made tea, and Lia climbed into her lap and asked for a story about dinosaurs who went to school. Life, as always, resumed in small, meaningful increments. Grayson did not take a victory lap. He had sat in the back row like a person watching a private weather report, hands folded, feeling that the hope he had pitched into the world had been validated by the thing that mattered, a system recognizing what a child needed. His interventions had been legal and careful. Funds set up through a non-profit trustee, pro bono counsel retained through a colleague, documentation funneled into the case without names attached. The court had accepted the trust as an instrument supportive of Lia's well-being without transforming Tessa into a public case study. That was the line he had insisted on. Help that did not claim ownership. Tessa smelled the faint trace of the library carpet in the air, and it anchored her. The thing she most wanted was not applause, but the ability to keep doing what she did every day, making sure a child learned to care for the small things. The rest could simmer elsewhere. She sent an awkward, grateful text to the lawyer. She sent nothing to the man who had sat in the back. She could not, at that moment, reconcile gratitude with the precise geography of pride. She still needed language to explain how she could accept without becoming less. Grayson left town the next day, returning to the life that required suitcases and meetings and a horizon measured in planes. It was easier for him to travel than to stop being watchful. He kept a modest rhythm of contact, helpful notes about grants, suggestions on things Tessa could apply for, a periodic delivery of books for the children's corner labelled simply, "From a friend." He declined interviews. He declined pictures. When townspeople tried to piece together who the invisible threads belonged to, he shrugged away suspicion. Anonymity was his deliberate humility. Months folded into a year. The kinds of small gifts that had kept them afloat. An after-school tutor paid discreetly, a food voucher inserted into the library's desk for families in need, a grant that paid for new story-hour carpets, became the scaffolding of stability. The community was not static. It changed around the edges. People who had once been strangers offered babysitting on Friday nights. A local contractor volunteered time to patch the library's leaky roof. The town recognized, in private and public ways, that children's needs mattered enough to move people. Derek kept his visitation. Sometimes he arrived with flowers and carefully timed texts announcing intention. Over time, the court monitored interactions and requested updates. Sometimes he showed up with genuine warmth. Other times his presence was performative. The legal system kept its slow, bureaucratic pace. Tessa navigated it with the same determination she applied to shelving new picture books. Meticulous, unflashy, focused. 3 years passed with all the small constellations of life that make a town feel whole. Winters with ice, summers with town fairs, a Christmas pageant where Lyra refused to stop twirling even when the music stopped, and quiet afternoons where Tessa stacked donated paperbacks into neat piles. The children's corner in the library grew from a modest table and a beanbag into a brighter, better-lit wing that could hold story time and tutoring sessions. The expansion had started as a dream scribbled on a napkin and become a plan with line items and volunteers and a fundraising campaign that took off one grassroots donation at a time. On a late spring morning, the sort that gives the world a gentle green sheen, the town gathered for a modest ribbon cutting. Balloons bobbed, a local band played a tune, and parents brought cupcakes. Lyra, now 7 and impossibly earnest, wore the same dinosaur socks that had seen her through the custody hearing years earlier. She twirled on a patch of new carpet and declared loudly that dragons would be welcome at story hour. Townsfolk smiled. The mayor gave a short speech about community, and a row of children read aloud, voices bright and imperfect. There was a guest list that included donors and volunteers, but one seat remained conspicuously unlisted. People murmured when a man stepped forward to the lectern, someone whose face had started to come up in conversations when people traced the trail of anonymous contributions. He was not loudly introduced as a mega donor or a flashy sponsor. Instead, an advocate from the steering committee, the social worker who had once tucked a receipt into Tessa's bag, cleared her throat and spoke about the quiet benefactor who had preferred to operate through legal means and non-profit channels in order to ensure the library's future without personal aggrandizement. The crowd watched as the man in a simple jacket, who later would be recognized by a few for his travel schedule and by some for a boardroom photograph in the regional paper, moved down the line. He approached the ribbon with a pair of scissors that looked ordinary in his hands. The shock was not that a successful man had helped. The surprise was that the help had been so discreet, so structurally sound, and so respectful of the people it was meant to serve. Tessa stood near the back, arms folded in a posture that had become second nature when the town's stories orbited her life. Grayson's presence registered before she understood its implications. There was, at first, a flicker of the private knot she had kept since the first sandwich. gratitude mixed with the sting of being given room by someone whose life took different shapes. She watched him speak to the steering committee quietly, and the committee read a short statement about the anonymous trust that had funded the wing's creation. How the funds had been structured, the legal safeguards, the requirement that the resources be used solely for educational and child-centered programs. Then the woman with the social work credentials called Tessa forward. "This wing," she said to the crowd, "was made possible by many hands and by one careful trust. We believed the most honest way to honor that trust was to let the people who would use this space decide how it would be named." Tessa stepped forward, and for a moment the world narrowed to the squeak of a ribbon and the clapping of neighbors. She felt the familiar burn of unease. Publicness was not her favorite setting, but the ceremony itself was gentle. A plaque was unveiled that read simply, "The Children's Corner for all of Westbridge." There was no donor's name. The crowd cheered, and the band played an old, uncomplicated tune. After the ribbon cutting and the photos, the ones Tessa agreed to because Laya tugged at her sleeve and wanted evidence of the day, the man who had been watching from the edge of the crowd approached. He looked like any other person who had been in the right place at the right time, which was exactly the point. He did not make a speech. He did not offer a billowing announcement. He offered something smaller and more personal. "Tessa," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear against the town's ambient happiness. "I didn't do this for thanks. I did it because someone once left a sandwich on a table and the world felt possible. I thought the right thing was to build a place where a child could find a book and keep it without wondering if someone else had paid the price to read." The words were short, honest, and without attempt to flatter. He reached into his coat and drew out a small plain ring, the kind of token that meant intention without theatre. It was not an extravagant jewel. It was a narrow band, worn and brushed, like a promise that had walked through ordinary days. Tessa's first impulse was to step back. Pride still sat beside gratitude, like two old companions who disagreed about how to behave. She looked at the ring, at the man who had made a livelihood of numbers, and at Laya, whose eyes now searched her face for clues on how to respond. Grayson, unflappable in boardrooms and gentle at life's edges, did not demand acceptance. He did not ask for a public declaration. He handed the ring to Tessa, and then softly to Laya. "Keep it," he said. "For now, keep it as a promise between us. I'm not trying to fix anything I didn't break. I only want to be present in a way that's helpful and small. If someday you want more than that, I'll learn to show up for it." There was no fanfare, but the gesture was decisive. It respected Tessa's agency because it invited her consent rather than staging a reveal that would make her feel indebted. Laya, in the way that children understand grown-up gestures more clearly than adults imagine, put the ring on her own finger, where it looked comically large, and then passed it to her mother. The crowd watched a private exchange and gave it the public kindness of silence. Later, when people asked about the identity of the anonymous donor, the town's stories split into versions that smoothed edges and added color. Some were shocked that someone of means had cared without headline. Others felt warmed to learn that a man who could afford to be magnanimous had chosen discretion. What surprised most was not the money. Towns often spoke of wealth and its uses, but the way it had been wielded, with legal care, with respect for parental dignity, and without choreography. Tessa accepted the ring on her own terms. Later that evening at the library, with Laya asleep and August on the chair beside her, she laid the ring on the counter and turned it between her fingers. It was small enough to hide in a drawer. It was large enough to carry meaning. She understood finally that accepting help need not erase the work she had done. It could be a way of multiplying the care she already gave. Grayson did not stay for a celebratory dinner. He had a flight to catch and a company deadline. But he lingered long enough to stand in the doorway and watch Laya twirl in the new carpet, her laughter a clear bell. He had become, in the town's folk memory, less of a stranger and more of a person who noticed the small things that shape a life. The shock the title promised was less a dramatic reveal and more the gentle astonishment a town felt when it discovered a private kindness had been the scaffolding of a public good. 3 years after an anonymous username and a brown paper bag, the unsuspecting kindness that had once been a single sandwich had become a children's wing full of books, tutoring sessions, and a modest trust ensuring Lia's future education. The man who had been Hailstone Online had, in the end, turned presence into a practice rather than an announcement. The quiet epilogue unfolded over ordinary days. Grayson visited sometimes, more often with a book than with a check. Tessa grew bolder in asking for what the library needed. Lia learned to read long, complicated words and to attach them to imagined dragons. Sometimes Grayson would arrive in town on a weekend and help paint shelves or read a chapter to a row of children who paid more attention to his voice than to his resume. Small acts had grown into reliable rhythms. One evening, years later, and far from the courthouse where futures had once been argued, Tessa found the folded note she had kept all those years, the one that had first said, "For Moth." She smoothed the paper against her palm and smiled without strain. The server's lobby, the chat pings, the avatars, they had been a beginning, not a full story. What had followed was messy and long and real. It had required patience, paperwork, social workers, friends who vouched, and a man who learned to give without taking credit. Sometimes, people assume that charity must dazzle to matter. The truth that Westbridge learned was different. Care that honors someone's dignity and asks permission to help has a way of landing where it matters most. Small kindnesses, when made structural and thoughtful, can alter the shape of a childhood. They can turn solitude into community, fear into routine, and a single brown paper bag into a library wing where children discover books and belong. On cool nights, when the Westbridge server logged on and a few of the old names drifted past one another like memories with networked hearts, someone would sometimes write a quiet message in the lobby. Remember to check on your neighbor. It was a line that could have been taken for trite sentiment until you saw a child curled up with August and a book in a room lit by the steady hum of people who cared. If this story warmed you, subscribe for more stories of quiet kindness that change lives.